You can spend time with people you call close and still feel subtly alone, not abandoned, not excluded, just not fully connected. The conversation flows, the contact is regular, the relationship is intact, yet something inside remains untouched. This often happens in ordinary, stable relationships. You talk daily with a partner, coordinate responsibilities, share routines. You meet friends, exchange updates, react to each other's stories. Nothing appears dysfunctional. From the outside, the relationship works. That is precisely why the internal distance is difficult to name. Many people assume that proximity equals closeness. If someone is physically present, emotionally available must follow. If communication is frequent, connection must exist. But these are structural indicators. They show interaction, not necessarily emotional resonance. Emotional closeness involves a specific experience, the sense that your inner world is acknowledged without being simplified or redirected. It requires more than shared activity or agreement. It involves being seen without adjustment. When that does not occur, relationships can remain functional but feel emotionally neutral. Because this gap develops gradually, it rarely becomes dramatic enough to demand attention. There is no obvious conflict, no clear rejection, just a quiet awareness that, despite having people nearby, there is no internal feeling of being deeply met. Over time, people adapt. They stop expecting emotional depth and focus instead on stability, productivity, or shared plans. They may become reliable partners, good listeners, socially active individuals. The structure of connection remains intact, while the emotional core becomes secondary. Most do not consciously recognize this pattern because it resembles maturity. It looks like independence. It looks like calmness. But underneath, there is a subtle tension. If people are close, why does closeness not register? That question often remains unasked and unanswered. The feeling of emotional distance in the presence of others rarely appears by accident. It usually develops as a logical adaptation to earlier experiences, where closeness did not consistently feel safe, effective, or rewarding. In childhood, emotional connection depends on how caregivers respond to vulnerability. When a child expresses fear, sadness, or excitement, the response they receive shapes an internal expectation. When I show what I feel, something supportive happens. Or the opposite. When I show what I feel, nothing changes, or it creates tension. Consider a simple example. A child grows up in a household where practical needs are reliably met, but emotional reactions are minimized. When the child says, "I'm upset," the response is, "It's not a big deal," or "Focus on something useful." There is no hostility, just redirection. Over time, the child learns that emotions do not improve connection, they complicate it. The brain adapts by reducing emotional expression and relying on functionality instead. Another scenario may involve unpredictability. A caregiver sometimes responds warmly, and other times withdraws or reacts irritably. The child cannot predict the outcome of emotional openness. The safest strategy becomes restraint. If you share less, you risk less confusion or rejection. The brain is efficient. It does not aim for depth, it aims for stability. If emotional vulnerability has historically led to discomfort or inconsistency, the brain builds a pattern of self-regulation that does not depend on others. This becomes internalized as independence. Later in life, this adaptation persists. The person may maintain relationships, communicate regularly, and appear socially engaged. Yet their nervous system does not automatically associate closeness with emotional relief. It associates closeness with coordination, cooperation, or shared activity. The mechanism is simple. When emotional exposure was unreliable or unnecessary for survival, the mind learned to prioritize structure over emotional resonance. The result is connection without felt intimacy. Not because intimacy is unwanted, but because the system was trained to function without it. In adulthood, this adaptation often looks like competence. A person becomes reliable at work, clear in communication, efficient in solving problems. They do not depend heavily on emotional reassurance. They manage stress internally and rarely ask for support unless it is practical. From the outside, this appears stable and mature. In relationships, the same pattern continues. The person may be loyal, responsible, and present. They share plans, coordinate life, discuss tasks. Conflict is often handled rationally. However, emotional exposure remains limited. Feelings are filtered, simplified, or expressed in controlled ways. Partners may describe them as calm but slightly distant. Over time, a subtle paradox emerges. The strength that once ensured stability now creates tension. Independence reduces the risk of rejection, but it also reduces the depth of emotional exchange. The ability to self-regulate protects against chaos, yet it prevents the experience of being emotionally supported. This tension can appear in these different areas. At work, the person may prefer control and self-sufficiency, avoiding collaboration that requires vulnerability. With money, they may emphasize security and predictability, reinforcing autonomy. In friendships, they might maintain contact, but avoid conversations that move into uncertainty or emotional complexity. Loneliness in this context is not dramatic isolation. It is a quiet absence of emotional resonance. The person may not immediately recognize it because nothing feels obviously wrong. Their life functions, they are not dependent, not overwhelmed. The discomfort is subtle and therefore easy to rationalize as personality or preference. The internal conflict remains partially hidden because the adaptation works. It produces stability and control. The cost is less visible. Emotional closeness feels abstract or unnecessary until moments of stress, loss, or transition reveal that independence does not fully replace connection. The model protects and limits at the same time. Without reflection, the protective aspect tends to overshadow the limitation, making the loneliness difficult to identify as part of the same mechanism. When this pattern becomes visible, it does not need to be judged. It is not a flaw in character, nor a failure to connect. It is a coherent strategy that once reduced uncertainty and preserved emotional stability. The system learned to rely on what was predictable: self-control, structure, competence. In many situations, this worked. Understanding this changes the perspective. Instead of asking, "Why can't I feel close even when people are near?" the question becomes, "What did closeness mean in my earlier experience?" Often it meant unpredictability, discomfort, or inefficiency. The mind responded logically. Minimize emotional exposure, maximize control. When this logic is recognized, something subtle shifts. The person no longer interprets their emotional distance as proof that something is missing in others or in themselves. It becomes a pattern with history. That recognition alone can reduce internal tension. What felt confusing begins to look consistent. Awareness does not automatically produce emotional depth. It does, however, create choice. If distance is understood as a learned response rather than a fixed trait, closeness stops being abstract. It becomes something that was once unnecessary or risky, not something inherently inaccessible. This perspective also reframes loneliness. Instead of seeing it as evidence of isolation despite having people around, it can be understood as the natural result of a system designed for independence. The independence remains real, so does the cost. There is no need to dismantle the entire structure that provided stability. The adaptation served a purpose, but when its origins are clear, the person may notice moments where emotional closeness feels less threatening than before, not because they forced it, but because it is no longer mistaken for danger. The model is neither good nor bad, it is intelligent, and like any intelligent adaptation, it continues until it is consciously understood.